Okay, we'll move on now. I'll just mention this post here, which is again a series of slides from the lecture, which I've pulled out and put on their own, about the anatomy of a WordPress theme. And so I'll sort of be referring to the same sort of stuff as I'm going through the demonstration as well. But I've also came across this quite nice sort of infographic display which summarizes a lot of that information as well, from a website called Yoast, which breaks down all of the constituent parts that go into making up a WordPress theme. So I will be going through all of these things, but I think this is quite a nice sort of cheat sheet kind of thing to refer back to remind yourself of exactly what's going on, and how all the parts of the theme fit together. So I'll move on now to a demonstration of creating a WordPress theme from scratch. And for most of this, I'm going to be again referring to the WordPress's own documentation on theme development, which I've linked here. Okay, which looks like this. So this is a very comprehensive document, and it sort of covers all bases and, you know, quite advanced theming concepts. So it's very complete, but it's also quite a lot of information. So I'm sort of going to demonstrate some subsections of that today. Probably the more common parts of theming and the more common template parts. And I've linked down here the various sections of that document which will be relevant to the parts that I'm going to be demonstrating. I've also linked here, again, I mentioned this in the lecture, most of the PHP that we're writing in a WordPress theme is simply going to be calling built-in WordPress functions. Okay, and these are referred to as template tags and also just functions themselves. So I've got a link to the documentation for the template tags and the function references there as well. And this last link here is just another alternative tutorial, if you want another perspective on it, of doing the same thing, creating a WordPress theme from scratch. And it's got lots of good pictures and is explained in nice simple terms. And actually a lot of the images that I've referenced in the lecture slides actually come from that website. Things like this. It's a little bit old now. Some of the things that it tells you to do are there's better ways of doing it now, but as a general process, it's still quite a good one to follow. Again, if you want another perspective on this whole process. Okay, so I need some starting point to start from, and what I'm actually going to do is use the static site files from last week's example as a starting point. You could, if you want, just start creating the PHP files in the theme and build up the style sheets and the content as you go. It's certainly possible to do that, but I think an easier way to get your head around the process is to first do all of your design work. Okay, create your wireframes and your mock-ups, decide what content you want, how you're going to categorize that throughout the site. Do your style guide, so you figured out, you know, what colors you want to use, what fonts, how the headings are going to be a different size to the paragraphs, how videos are going to look, how images are going to look. Do all of that stuff first, and that's all in your first assignment. Okay, and once you've done that, my suggestion is that you take a typical layout and you actually mock that up as a static web page in just HTML and CSS, much like the static website that we looked at last week was. And then when you have that, you can take that and start cutting it up and turning it into a WordPress theme. And I think that's probably the way to do it with the most gentle learning curve and the best way to sort of get your head around the process. So that's the way I'm going to demonstrate it. If you want to do it a different way, if you start to become really comfortable with it and you want to create the theme and the styling as you go, then that's up to you. But this is my suggestion for probably the best way to understand the process. So I've got a link here to the static website files from last week's example. Again, there's no specific reason that you need to follow along line by line as I do it. I'll need to go through it reasonably quickly to fit it all in. But I would recommend that at some point you attempt this process before getting to the second part of the assignment. You'll always be amazed at trying something once, the hindsight that you get from that, just thinking how much better I could have made it if I had have known all this stuff at the beginning. So yeah, I do recommend that you try this once, that you don't let your second assignment be the first time that you attempt to make a WordPress theme. Okay, so I've downloaded the, what have we got here? Okay, I've downloaded the static website files. Okay, and these are the files here, just to remind you what it looks like. Okay, it looks like this. Okay, so it's just a fairly basic layout with a header, navigation, content area, sidebar, and a footer, and it's got some basic styling. In your case, for your assignment, I'd suggest that you want to have all of your styling figured out by this point, so that all you're doing when it comes to making the theme is just sort of cutting it up, and you don't have to do too much extra styling as you go through that process. Okay, but this is just an example, so this is fine for demonstration purposes. So the first thing I need to do is figure out where to put my theme files. So if we look at, okay, and I'm actually going to stop using FileZilla to transfer my files now. I'm going to use the inbuilt FTP client in my editor to do this instead. Okay, but I just want to make sure that you realize that each time I'm making edits here to the files, okay, they're automatically being saved to the web server. Okay, so just not forgetting that very important step. Okay, so first I'm going to make sure I've got my config file there. Okay, so this is the structure of my my WordPress site now. Okay, and there's a folder called WP-content, and inside of that there is a folder called themes. Okay, and logically enough, this is where we install our themes. So each theme needs to live inside of its own directory, and you can see that there's the two built-in themes are represented there. Okay, 2012 and 2013. So what I need is a directory name which somehow relates to the name of my theme. So I'd rather not call my theme static site. That doesn't make too much sense. So I'm just going to give it a name like test theme. Okay, and that's going to be the name of my theme directory. Now what I need to do is make sure that this theme directory, is bear with me for a second. Okay, what I need to do is make sure that this theme directory is in the correct location on my web server. So I'm going to copy that across and put it inside of my themes directory. Okay, and I will just double check that that's uploaded to my remote web server. Okay, there it is. Alright. So, once I'm sure that's on my web server, I'm going to come back to my themes administration page and I'll hit refresh and we'll see if anything changes here. We'll see if it recognizes a new theme. Okay, so I refresh and something's different, but what it tells me here is that it's recognized that there's a broken theme. Okay, so it's recognized that I've got a new theme there, but it's not, there's something wrong. There's something that's not in the correct format. So what it tells me here is that themes must have a style sheet and a template. Okay, and to elaborate upon that, I will have a look at this link. No, sorry, I'll have a look at this link. Okay, so there's a section of that theme development page which talks about your basic templates. Okay, and one of the first things it says is that at the very minimum, a WordPress theme consists of two files, a style.css file and an index.php file. So in order for it to be recognized as a WordPress theme, I needed a very minimum those two things. So the first thing I'm going to do is, well, firstly I'm going to delete this about.html page because I don't need it. And I'm going to rename my index.html file to index.php. Okay, so now I have an index.php file and I have a style.css file. We'll see if that's made any difference. So I refresh. Okay, and it still tells me that the theme is broken. Now, one of the other things that WordPress requires is that as well as the default style sheet being called style.css, it actually requires that is located in the root folder of the theme directory. Now in my case I have it in a subfolder called CSS, and this is one of the hindsight things. If I had created this static website knowing it was going to eventually become a WordPress theme, knowing that, I would have just put the style.css file in the theme directory. So it's not that hard to change it. It's not that hard to change it here, but what it does mean is if I've got relative URLs pointing to things like images in my style sheet, then those are going to need to be updated if I move that file outside of the CSS subdirectory. But anyway, we'll do that anyway because it's not that hard. In fact, I'll move both of my CSS files out. Okay, and fortunately my code editor will actually automatically fix those references for me, but if not, I would have had to come in and modify those paths there to the image files. Okay, so I'll delete this CSS folder now that I'm not using it. Okay, so now I should have the two basic requirements to have this recognized as a theme. I have an index.php file and a style.css file, both located in the root directory of my theme folder. So now I should be able to come back to the themes administration page and refresh. Okay, and now it does seem to recognize another available theme. Okay, it still doesn't look quite right because these other two have nice screenshots and they have some information about them. Okay, so there is a couple more steps. So because themes can be packaged and then given to or sold to other people to install in their WordPress sites, okay, it's a good idea to include some information about that theme along with it, and also usefully some sort of screenshot so they can see what it might look like before they actually go and install it. So we'll deal with the textual information first. So I've got a link here to a section of that theme development page called Theme Style Sheet. Okay, and it tells us pretty much exactly what we need to know for this. Okay, so this information that you can see here is actually going to be drawn from a comment block that lives at the top of our style.css file. Okay, and that's exactly what this will tell you here, and it gives you an example of what that might look like. So essentially you've got a series of predefined terms here and then values. So things like the name, the theme URI. So if your theme is available for download, at which location can people download it? A description, an author, maybe an author's website, versions, tags, any licensing information, and so on and so forth. So you don't really need to fill all of this out. You can fill out just what's appropriate to you, but the easiest thing I think to do is just copy this code section and then go into our style.css file, paste it at the top, okay, and then just modify this with the information that's relevant to our theme. Okay, so for a theme name, you obviously, if you've got a more resolved idea for a theme, then you'll probably come up with a good name for it, but I'm just going to call this Dave's Test Theme. Okay, I'm not making it publicly available right now, so I'm not going to bother putting a website link for it. A description. Okay, I'll just call it a purple and black theme with header, footer, left content, and right sidebar. Okay, the author, usually we just put your name, maybe your website. A version number if you want, okay, if you're updating a theme, and then any tags that you might want. So I'll just say back to columns. Okay, and I won't bother with any of the rest of this stuff right now, but that's always something you can come back and modify at the end when you've completed the theme, and some of that information will be more relevant. Okay, so I've got that in there, I've saved it, make sure it's uploaded to the server, come back, refresh this page, and I should see some of this content here change now. Okay, and there we can see it is. Okay, so it's now, instead of just defaulting to the folder name for the theme name, it's using what I told it to use. It's putting the author name in there, and if I click this, it will link to the website that I've specified. Okay, and if I were to activate this theme, okay, I should see more information here, okay, including the description as well. Now the one thing that I don't have is a screenshot, and that's quite simple to add. Okay, again, I've got a link here to the relevant part of the documentation, and it tells us that essentially you just need a PNG file which you call screenshot.png, and it tells you the appropriate resolution to store it in this case 600 by 450. Now obviously this is something that you'll need to come back and do probably at the end when you've actually created the theme, when you've actually got the WordPress content in there and it looks legitimately like the WordPress site looks. I don't have that at the moment, so all I've done is taken a screenshot of what the static website looked like, and I'm going to use that as a placeholder. So I've got this screenshot.png which I prepared earlier here, and I'm simply going to copy that across into the root of my theme directory again. Okay, and as long as it's called screenshot.png, I'll make sure it's uploaded to the server. When I refresh, okay, that should be recognized by WordPress and loaded in. Okay, so now I have all the information that sort of describes my theme and appears correctly in this interface. Okay, so at this point what I will do is activate. So we'll go from this default theme. I'll activate my new theme, and we'll see what it looks like now on the front end interface of the website. Okay, so I'll hit refresh here. Alright, and we can see that it looks like this. So something's changed, but obviously something's not quite right either. For a start, it's not loading up any of my CSS styles. Okay, but I can see that the content contained within the HTML of my PHP file is showing. Okay, so it's at least looking in the correct place. So the next thing we need to do is, well, probably the obvious first thing to do is figure out what's going wrong with the CSS file and get it to work properly. So I've got a link here again to the same document, the section referencing files from a template. Okay, and what this will tell you is, well, let's have a look. Let's have a look at the site first, and we'll go inspect the element. Let's have a look at the head section and the part where I link to my style.css file. So when you're first looking at this, it may seem a little confusing as to why this might not be working. Okay, because in my directory, okay, I've got an index.php file here, and I've got a style.css file which is in the same directory. So it would make sense that simply referencing the style.css should find that file. Okay, but the thing is, the slightly confusing thing is that it's not this index.php file that WordPress is loading. Okay, this is simply the index.php file for the theme, but WordPress needs to load all of WordPress and then sort of sideload the theme. So the actual index.php file that WordPress is loading is this one here, which actually exists in the WordPress root directory. Okay, so that's what it's considering its root directory. So in order for that simple reference to a style.css file to resolve, I would have to have had my style.css file in the root directory of my WordPress installation. Okay, and I'm not going to move it there because that's not how it's meant to work as a theme. Okay, so the actual URL is going to be something like my URL /wp content /themes /test theme /style.css. Okay, that's going to be the correct URL to resolve my style sheet properly. Now I could hard code that in and it would work, but as the documentation will tell you, that's not advisable. One, because it's well, it's harder for a start. There's easier ways of doing it. But two, if I go and hard code that in and then at some point come back and decide to change the name of my theme folder, then all of a sudden that link will be broken again. Okay, so what we can do is use a built-in WordPress function to actually find that for us. And the function that we use is linked off this part of the documentation here, and we can use one. There's actually a couple of ways of doing this, and so you may see slightly different functions used, but they all essentially do the same thing. The one I will demonstrate is this function called blog info, and this is a function that we will actually use quite a lot. Okay, so this is a WordPress function. So if you were to look through the WordPress core files, you would find the definition of this function and what it does somewhere within there. Okay, but its purpose is essentially, as it says here, to display information about your site. Okay, so this is one example of the documentation for a particular WordPress function. And as you can see, it looks kind of similar to what we saw last week with the PHP functions documentation. Okay, it's a fairly formal, complete description, but fortunately they usually provide lots of good examples of common usages of this function as well. So you can see, for example, now down here, if you want to output the name of your site or the title of the site, then it will show you the exact code that you could just copy and paste in order to do that. Okay, but essentially the the form of this function will look like this. It's a PHP bit of PHP code, so obviously it needs to be wrapped in opening and closing PHP tags. And then we call the function and we pass it a parameter. And this parameter basically tells the blog info function which bit of information about the site we want it to output. Okay, and if we look down here under parameters, we can see all of the different options we can provide it. Okay, so things like name, description, the URL of the blog, a whole bunch of different things. And if we scroll down a little bit further, we can see that one of these is the style sheet URL, and it says it displays the primary CSS, usually style.css file, URL of the active theme. Okay, so what I need to do is come into the index.php file of my theme, and where I just have the hard-coded reference to my style.css file here, okay, I'm going to remove that, and I'm going to put some PHP in here, and I'm going to call the blog info. Sorry, let me just make sure my spelling is exactly correct. Blog info, one word, okay. Okay, I'm going to call the blog info function, and I'm going to pass it the parameter to get my style sheet URL. Okay, and there it is. So I need to pass it this text string here, style sheet URL. Okay, now one thing I should mention is I may have mentioned this already, but it's worth repeating. When we're using a text string in PHP or any programming language, okay, we can usually either indicate that by using double quotes or single quotes. Now the issue with embedding PHP and HTML is often you'll have sort of quotes inside of quotes, and it can get kind of confusing and often lead to errors in your code if you're doing that. So this quote may, for example, think that that's actually the opening and closing of a string. So what I like to do is use single quotes when I'm referencing a string in PHP, and use double quotes when I need them for the HTML. Okay, I still need these double quotes around that whole bit in the HTML because that's going to sit within that HTML href attribute. Okay, but so what I've done here is I've called the blog info function, and I've said give me the style sheet URL. Okay, if you remember last week, whenever we wanted to output something to the web page, we would actually write echo here. Okay, the reason I don't need to do that here is because if you were to look into this blog info URL, okay, you would find that effectively that statement is contained within the function. Okay, so it's doing the same thing. So all I have to do is call the function, and that bit of information will be output in replacement of this bit of PHP here. Okay, so we'll save that, make sure it's uploaded. Go back to the site, okay, and we're going to see how this bit here, the style.css, is now changed, hopefully to a correctly resolving URL. And if I hover over it here, okay, you can hopefully see the complete URL that it's attempting to find there. Okay, and as we've already seen, that KIB216.if90.net/style.css, okay, is not where my CSS file is existing. So that should be modified to the correct full URL to the style.css file as it exists in my theme directory. Okay, so we'll refresh the page. Okay, I can immediately see that is probably worked because I can see my styles are being applied. We'll look in the head section. Where are we here? Okay, and there it is. Okay, there's now the full URL. It extends over 2 lines, but it's okay. Okay, to the KIB216.if90.net slash WP content slash theme slash test theme slash style.css. Okay, and that is the correct full URL to that style sheet. Okay, so now the next thing that's still obviously broken to me is this logo here. Okay, and that's for a very similar reason. If I look at the code where I've put this, okay, the image source is attempting to find a relative path to an images folder and then logo.png. Okay, again, because this is in my theme directory now, it's not going to find that relative to the root directory of my website. So I'm going to need to do essentially the same thing, but rather than getting the style sheet URL, I'm going to still use blog info, but I'm going to pass it a parameter called template URL to just get me the path to my template directory, and then add on to the end of that my images slash logo.png path. Okay, so I'll come back to my code here. We'll find, where is it here, where I've embedded the image. Okay, and I'm simply going to, again, in the appropriate place, put the PHP, call the blog info function, tell it this time that I want the template URL. Okay, and that will output the directory up to essentially my test theme folder. But then I still need to include on the end of that the path to images and then finally logo.png. Okay, so that's why I need to leave this here slash images slash logo.png. So we'll save that, go back, refresh, okay, and my logo now, the path to my logo image now resolves correctly. Now you may well ask why I didn't have to do the same thing for this background, the background texture here, which I have a background bg.gif texture. And the reason for that is because that's referenced in my style.css file. And unlike in your PHP or your HTML files, if you're referencing images or resources from your CSS file, then they're always going to be relative from the location of that CSS file, rather than, in the case of our PHP files, it will be relative to the root directory. Okay, so that's why we don't need to worry about going and changing that in the CSS file. So that's something that's the same whether you're creating a static or a dynamic website, but it may just be something that you've not really had to think about before. Okay, so moving along. All right, so we've sort of got our our URLs and things hooked up correctly. I will do one more thing using blog info, which is to output the the name of the site, because at the moment, okay, it's still just outputting my static site. Okay, what I want it to output is the title of the site, which I entered into the administration interface, which should now be stored somewhere in the database. Okay, so in order to do that, again, very similarly, it's going to be using the blog info, call to the blog info WordPress function. I just have to find the correct place to put it. So, I'm going to want to put it in two separate places. First of all, where this heading is. So again, I'll make a call to blog info. Okay, and in this instance, I'm going to pass it the parameter name. So it will return me the name of my blog. Okay, and I'm going to want to do the same thing up in the title section of my head tag here, so that it also shows up in the title bar here. So it should change here and here. Okay, and there we go. Alright, so it's called Dave's site now. Now if I was to go back and If I was to go back into the administration interface and in the settings change the title of my site here, let's say I just changed it to Dave's test site. Okay, then that should be reflected when I refresh the page. Okay, in both places. Okay. Alright, so the next thing we're going to look at is starting to split this index.php file up into its constituent part templates. So there's a link here to a section called Basic Templates. Okay, and as it says, our minimal case is to have a style.css and an index.php file. You can, if you want, have index.php be the template for every content scenario on your website if you want. And on a very simple website, that may be all you need. But what we're going to be looking at is expanding upon that with both more templates for different content types, which we'll look at probably in later weeks, but also splitting them up into modular sub-templates so that they can then be included in different other content type templates. So this is going to be very similar again to what we did last week, where we split off the header, footer, and sidebar into different part files. The concept is essentially identical. It's just that instead of using PHP includes, we're going to use WordPress functions to include those bits of code back into the main template. Okay, and those functions are listed off down here. Okay, so a header, get sidebar, get footer, and get search form, which is another thing that we could do, which I don't have in this example. Okay, but one of the important things is that, again, we need to make sure that we call these template parts very specific, exact things. Okay, so if I want to split the header section off again, which I will split off, let's say, just like I did last week, this whole header part down, including the navigation. Okay, if I determine that that's going to be consistent across every page, then I'll split it off into its own sort of part template. So what I'm going to do is cut that bit out. I'm going to create a new PHP file. Now this has to be called header.php. Okay, and I'm going to paste that code that I've just cut into the header.php file. Now if I don't add anything else and I refresh the page, okay, I can see that that's gone. It's not including the header, which includes obviously my CSS links. Okay, so whereas last week we would do something like PHP include or require and then the name of a file like header.php. Okay, we do something very similar, but again, just to deal with the resolving of paths so that it's less work for us, we're going to use a WordPress function. Okay, so we're still going to use the PHP tags, but we're going to use a WordPress function called get underscore header. Okay, like that, and we put it exactly where we want, well, exactly where we cut the code from, exactly where we want it to be included back into our main template file. So save that, make sure it's uploaded, we refresh, okay, and then it includes back in. Okay, and so we can do the same thing again for the footer section of the site. So we'll cut that, put it in a new file called footer.php. Okay, so again, this has to be called exactly that, footer.php. Save that there, and we use we call the WordPress function get underscore footer. Okay, that includes that. And then finally, we also can do the sidebar. Now the sidebar has some extra options when we're dealing with it. Okay, so we'll look at the default option first of all. So I'll create a file called sidebar.php, paste the code for my sidebar in there, and sensibly enough, the function, the WordPress function we call to re-include it back in this template is get underscore sidebar. Okay. All right, and that's all still nice and working. Okay, now, so the extra options with get sidebar, if we click on this get sidebar function and go and look at the function reference here, you'll see that under the parameters it says it optionally can take a name. So what we can do is we can have multiple sidebar templates. And because, say, for example, you may have a left and a right sidebar template, or perhaps you want to have a different sidebar on different sections of your site. So it is possible to have multiple different sidebar templates that we can include by specifying a particular name. So what it says here is that we call get sidebar and then pass it a name, and what it will do is look for a file called sidebar hyphen and then that name that we've passed it .php. Okay, so let's just say then, let's just say I rename, let's say I rename this sidebar to sidebar hyphen S1. Okay, and I'll change the heading of this sidebar to just say sidebar 1. And then I'll copy this file or duplicate this file, call it sidebar hyphen S2, and then change the title to S2 and maybe add some more content just so it looks a bit different. Okay, so now I've got two sidebar template files, sidebar hyphen S1 and sidebar hyphen S2. So now in order to include one of these in my index.php file, I simply just pass it a parameter which refers to the name of the file that comes after the hyphen. So in this case, if I want sidebar 1, I'll say get sidebar S1. Okay, and if I refresh this, okay, there it is. There's my sidebar with the heading sidebar S1. If I want the second sidebar, then I use S2. Okay, so there's the sidebar. It's now loading in the sidebar template with the different content. Okay, and if I had a layout which had a left and a right sidebar, then there's nothing to stop me from calling that get sidebar twice, but with the different parameters to get one sidebar for the left one and the other sidebar maybe for the right one. Okay, so that's how we split up the main index template into multiple constituent templates. Hopefully, as you can see, is very similar to what we did last week. It's just that we use WordPress functions instead of writing out the plain PHP to do essentially the same thing. Okay, let's see what is next. Okay, I should mention, just to sort of step back to the header section for a moment, there are a bunch of things that WordPress sort of suggests that you put in the header, and they all contain various information about the WordPress site. So things like the description, the language attributes, all of this stuff. I'm not necessarily going to go through this today because I just don't want to over confuse the matter. But there is this section here which, if you wanted to use this as a starting point for the head section of your for your index page, then that might not be a bad idea to copy and paste that as a starting point and then modify that. But one specific point I do want to talk to, which is often overlooked, is one of the things that it puts in the header is this function called WP head. And when you put it in, on the surface it doesn't really look like it does anything. But it's actually quite vitally important to put in because it's required by a lot of plugins to actually get to work. So if you install a plugin and it say needs to include some JavaScript library in order for it to work, then it needs this, what's called an action hook, in order to run, to be able to inject its code into this part of the template. So often people forget to put this in when they're starting out because they don't have any plugins. It doesn't seem to make any difference, but then they'll install a plugin which needs this and then be sort of confused as to why it's not working. So it's important to put this in in the first place anyway, just because you will most likely at some point be requiring it if you're going to be installing any sort of plugins. So there's that WP head function, and I've got a link specifically to this function. Okay, and it tells you where are we here? It should say somewhere. Anyway, I won't bother reading through that, but the point is, it's generally suggested that the place where you need to put this is the very last thing in your head section before the closing head tag. So what I'm going to do is copy that line, jump over into my header.php file, and find my closing head tag here, and make sure I paste that in as the very last thing there. Now they've also recently added a counterpoint to that, which needs to go in the footer as well, and I've got a link to that here for WP footer. Okay, it's another action hook, just like the WP head, except you place this one in the footer. And I believe that the correct place to put this is, yes, as it says here, always put it just before the closing body tag in your HTML. Okay, so you can see it there. So I will go into my footer.php file here, find my closing body tag, and make sure that that is the very last thing that appears before that. Okay, and once you have those two things in there, then there shouldn't really be any reason for a plugin not to work with your new custom theme. At this point, I mean, you're not going to notice much of a difference. What you will notice maybe is that you get this admin bar here, which if you're logged into your site, you will get over the front of the front end of your site. Which non-logged in people won't see, but it gives you useful links to things in the back end, and that obviously, having just done that, requires those two functions in order to work. Okay. All right. So there's one more thing I want to go over this week, and then we'll leave sort of the rest of the parts for the coming weeks. So what we do need to look at next, and maybe sort of the most complex part to get your head around, is my theme is still just displaying the dummy content that I've put in the files as static HTML. So obviously I'm going to want to output the post content that's stored in my database in my theme. Rather than this static dummy content. So that's the last thing I want to demonstrate, and I'll show you how to do that now. First of all, I'm going to get rid of this dummy content. I just simply had it there as a way of making sure that the layout looked right. Okay, if I get rid of it, nothing shows up. So that's fine, that's okay. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm being a little bit pedantic semantically, but my original layout for this just had sort of akin to one post, and really what I want to demonstrate is multiple posts output on the page. And so to me, each post should be sort of wrapped within an article HTML element. So all I'm going to do is just change this, but I still need this here, this main content section, because that's what styles the background colors of that section. So all I'm going to do is change this to a section element. You could change it to a div if you wanted to. I don't really mind, but I'm going to keep that there, and then each of my posts I'm going to output within an article element. Okay, so that's not so important functionally, but it's just a design thing. Again, in hindsight, if I knew I was developing this for a WordPress theme, I probably would have developed my mock-up with multiple posts being output on the page and keeping that in mind. Okay, so the thing that allows us to output WordPress post content is going to be called the loop. And these last two links here speak exactly to that. They sort of cover the same content. It's just that the first one, I guess, is kind of like the official, all-encompassing documentation, which may be a bit more obscure or hard to get into. And then there's this link to the loop in action, which is a bit more of a plainly explained, step-by-step explanation of what the loop is. But I'll give you my own explanation as well, which is kind of derived from bits of both of these. So it's called the loop because essentially that's exactly what it is. It's a PHP loop which is designed to output a series of posts within a template. So just to step back for a second and look at how WordPress works. Okay, if we take my site for example, okay, if I go to just the main site, dave.if90.net. Okay, so this will be loading up my default index template. And the default behavior is to list, you know, all of the recent posts in reverse chronological order. Okay, and then depending on where I navigate, if I navigate to a single post, okay, it's going to load up just one content item. If I navigate to a category, okay, the URL changes, but it's going to load just the content items based on the category. Okay, so the information that WordPress loads from the database is determined by the URL structure. Okay, so we can take for granted that every time we load up WordPress and load up our template, okay, there's going to be a certain, it's going to have gone and gotten a certain bunch of content based on the URL. Okay, in this case, the index template is going to go and get me all of my posts. Okay, so all we have to do inside of our template is create a loop which tells it to loop over that list of posts, and for each post output the relevant bits of information about that post that we want to display. So the loop, so there's part of this loop in action page which there's a section called the world's simplest index page, and it looks like a condensed version of what we already have. Okay, get header, get sidebar, get footer, and then there's this section in the middle. Okay, and this here is essentially a simple version of the WordPress loop. So I'm going to copy those bits of code in the middle, and I'm going to put them in between PHP tags and inside here. Okay, in my main content section where I want the post content to be output. And I'm actually going to simplify this even a little bit further because really all we need for the loop to function is this inner part. Okay, there's an extra surrounding if statement which I will just ignore for now for the sake of simplicity. Okay, and I will delete that part. So this here, what I've got written, these 3 lines, this is the sort of minimal case of what you need to write a WordPress loop. Now last week we looked at a couple of loops. The syntax was slightly different. There were 4 loops and 4 each loops. Okay, this is a while loop. Okay, so the syntax is slightly different, but essentially they all do the same thing. Okay, so the 4 loops were looping through numbers or looping over an array. What this one does is a while loop will continue looping while the condition inside of these rounded parentheses here still maintains to be true. Okay, and so the condition is returned by this function here. So have posts is a WordPress function. So if we can take for granted that we visit a page, okay, whether it's a category or the home page, WordPress is going to go and look for a bunch of content. In the case of the home page, it's going to look for a reverse chronological order of all the posts that I have. Okay, so at some point it's got some list. Now this function here basically just says, as we step through that list of posts, are there still any that exists? Okay, and this function here, the post, sort of tells it to go and look at the next one. So the combination of these two things is what makes our loop work. We say, go and look at the next one, and then do something with it, and then come back, and if there's any more, then go and look at the next one after that, and keep going, so on and so forth. Okay, until finally we've run out of posts, and then this will no longer be true, and it will break out of the while loop, and it will continue to draw the sidebar and the footer and the rest of the page. Okay, now even if that doesn't make any sense, you can still sort of do this just by knowing that that's what you have to write at the beginning of the loop, and that's what you have to write at the end of the loop. Okay, so the important thing is what you write in the middle of this loop. So what you normally write in here is a bunch of HTML interspersed with some WordPress functions which output the content in a framework of HTML that you want it to output in. So I'm going to start outputting some HTML here now. So what I need to make sure is that my PHP is closed off correctly. Okay, so this is probably the first example where we've seen a lot of PHP and HTML interspersed. So it's quite important to make sure that the PHP is exactly enclosed in PHP tags, and as soon as I'm going to start writing HTML, okay, like for example this, if I create a heading, okay, it needs to be outside of the PHP tags. So I create some HTML, and then I'm going to call some WordPress functions that allow me to output certain information about the post. Now the first thing I'm going to output is the title of the post. And the way I can do that is using a WordPress function called the underscore title. Okay, you'll notice that these are pretty logically named, and they all follow the same sort of format. It'll be the underscore and then the thing that you want to output. And you'll find reference to all of these in the function reference and the template tag links which I provided on my blog. Okay, so what this will do now is for each of the posts that it has, we'll output a heading, and then inside of that heading 2 tags, it will output the title of the post. So we'll save that, go back to my post here, okay, and then there you can see there's my post, Hello World. Now I only have one post, so it's only going through that loop once. But if I go in and then add another post, here we go, add new. Okay, and I publish that. Then I can come back and refresh my page somewhere here. Okay, and there's my second post. Okay, so again, the default behavior of the index page is to return all of your posts in reverse chronological order, like a blog. Okay, so the most recent content is at the top. So that's why we're seeing it output my second post first and my first post second. Okay, just because it's outputting in reverse chronological order. You can change the order of that. There are ways of doing that, which we can look at later on if you want. But this is the default behavior of the index page. So we've output the title here. So we can inspect this element. Okay, we can see there's the heading. Okay, and there's the content of the title of that post, which will be stored somewhere in the database. Okay, and then we simply just build upon this with more information. So if I want to then output the content of the post here after the title, then I can, and maybe I want to wrap it in a div for some reason, for styling purposes. Okay, let's say I wrap it in a div with a class of post content. Okay, then I would use the WordPress function, the underscore content. Okay, and now it should output the title and the content. All right, now, and there's a whole myriad of other things that you can output for each post. And you'll find that within the documentation, and you'll decide, depending on your site, the kind of things that you want to output. So if you look further down on this loop in action page, you can see that there's things like you can output the time of the post and the author. I could just copy this across here. Okay, and modify that slightly there. Okay, and it's all using similar sort of functions. Okay, so there's the time with some parameters, which I'm assuming format the time in a particular way or the date in a particular way, and then there's a function which will output the author. Okay, refresh that, and it adds to that then the date of the post, which is today, which makes sense. Okay, and then the username who created them. So this is what I was talking about earlier. If I had to call myself admin, you would see admin output there. And if it's a different user who's created the post, then you will see that output there if you've got multiple contributors to the website. Okay, now one final thing that is probably useful demonstrating is, again, if I just look at my website over here. Okay, so at the moment I'm looking at a category, which is returning a bunch of posts within a category. Now sometimes, particularly if they're long posts, and you want to show a lot of small bits of information in a small area, then what you'll actually do is, rather than outputting the entire content of the post, is output an excerpt. In which case it's usually useful to be able to link then to the full content of the post. So I can go and look at any of these posts by themselves just by clicking the title of one of these posts. Okay, and then it will load up that single post by itself without any of the other posts in that category. Okay, so we can do that, and again, this is all determined by the URL. Okay, so we can do that exact same thing simply by slightly modifying our heading here, where we're outputting the title of the post, by adding a href. Okay, by adding a link with an href, and I won't fill that in just yet. Okay, so we wrap that around the title of the post that will be output. Okay, and for the href here, again, this is not something we're going to want to hard code, but we can call a function, a WordPress function called the_permalink. Okay, which will output there the URL which points specifically to that one post. Okay, and so WordPress calls that the permalink. If we look at any of these posts, you can see a section here which tells us what the permalink is. Okay, so it's my URL, and then again, very similarly to what we did last week, the default way that it does it is that it will use a get parameter which points to a specific ID of a post that exists within the database. Okay, so that's what the permalink function will output for each of these posts within the loop. So we'll save that, go back to our website, hit refresh. Okay, now these are links, and if I inspect them, okay, I can see that that exact URL is being output there. So now if I click on this here, okay, it will load up, and you can see the URL is modified up here, and it will load just the content for that post. Okay, so now in the case of my website, you'll notice that it's using actually a different template for the single post versus the category of posts. Okay, on my single post template, I don't have a sidebar, for example, but I have then a comment section. Okay, so this is what we'll sort of lead into later on, is I could, if I want, go and add more templates to this. I could add one called single.php, which styles a single post in a different way to what my index.php file does. But going back to that template hierarchy diagram that we looked at, which is somewhere in here. Okay, this one here. Okay, remembering that basically it will look for a bunch of specific templates, and if they exist, it will use them. But if they don't exist, it always defaults back to the index.php file here. So that's why, even though I don't have a single post template on my test theme that I've just created here, it will still display. It will just use the index template in order to display that. And the only difference being is that in the loop, instead of having all of the posts to display, it's just got that one post to display. So it will only go through that loop once. Okay, so that's pretty much everything I wanted to go through today. Let me just double check for sure. Yep. Okay, so I think that's a good place to stop there. There's still some things that we haven't done, which we will look at in the coming weeks. We haven't sorted out the navigation, for example, or changed the sidebar. But I think this is a good place to stop for today. I think that's enough to take in. Are there any questions on anything I've gone over today? First of all, if anyone wants to ask now, or wait until you formulate them later. Okay, that's fine. I know I went through a lot of stuff. There's the screen recording, which I will upload, which you can watch again and slow down and start and stop. Yep, question. Yes, I can do that. So I'll also upload a link to the template directory as it exists in its current state now. Yep, and then we'll probably keep building on that in the weeks to come. Okay, so as I said, I really do think it would be beneficial to go through this process, because it's obviously not going to sink in fully until you've actually done it. But I think it would be beneficial to go through this process at least once before you attempt it on your assignment, and I think you'll find the end quality of your assignment will be a lot better if you do that.